Therefore, Donald Trump recently requested 50% of a $6.4 billion bridge which Canada constructed, Canada financed, and which the United States already jointly owns. And Mark Carney's rebuttal was so devastatingly factual that the White House has not managed to prepare a reply in 72 hours. This is not a trade conflict. This is not a diplomatic impasse. This is an individual who requested ownership of something his nation already possesses, requested payment for expenses his nation never incurred, requested recognition for materials his nation already provided, and requested it all with the assurance of someone who obviously has never examined the pact he's challenging. And when the Canadian Prime Minister positioned himself at a lectern, holding the real contract in his grasp, and recited it through a microphone, detail by detail, amount by amount, provision by provision, the White House became mute, not hushed, mute. 3 prepared replies discarded since none could tackle the accurate assertions without validating them. The Gordie Howe International Bridge, longest cable-stayed bridge in North America, 6 lanes linking Detroit, Michigan to Windsor, Ontario. 220 Eisenhower towers shaped to mimic hockey sticks as homage to the Saskatchewan-born icon who played 25 seasons with the Detroit Red Wings. 2,000 days of building, 98% finished. Cost $6.44 billion Canadian dollars, 100% covered by Canada. Not $1 of American federal funds, and per the 2012 Crossing Pact, equally owned 50-50 by Canada and the state of Michigan, with toll income divided once Canada recoups its outlay. When you grasp what Canada truly created, what the pact truly states, what Trump truly requested, and what Warren Buffett stated regarding the distinction between gaining ownership and requesting ownership, you'll grasp why experts are labeling this the most humiliating 72 hours of Trump's presidency. Not because he failed in a discussion, because there was never anything to discuss. Canada covered the expense. The invoice is $6.4 billion, and you can't request shares on an invoice that another party settled. But the requests aren't even the most humiliating aspect. Hold on until you learn what Trump stated about this precise bridge in 2017. And what Buffett stated about the distinction between influence and privilege explains everything about why this clash concluded before it began. Hit subscribe. You need to hear every word of what follows. Let me begin with the bridge itself, because you need to grasp what Canada created before you can value the ridiculousness of what Trump requested. The Gordie Howe International Bridge is not simply another border passage. It is the biggest binational infrastructure endeavor in North American history. 2.5 kilometers of cable stayed bridge crossing the Detroit River, linking one of America's most famous industrial cities to one of Canada's most active trade routes. 6 lanes of traffic plus a designated walkway and bike path. A-shaped towers ascending 220 meters above the river, 722 feet taller than most skyscrapers on the Detroit skyline, intentionally crafted to suggest hockey sticks, a nod to the man whose name the bridge bears. Gordie Howe, born in Floral, Saskatchewan, 25 seasons with the Detroit Red Wings, the man they called Mr. Hockey, died in 2016 at the age of 88. The most Canadian thing about Detroit, honored by the most remarkable piece of engineering on the continent, the bridge is not small. It is the longest cable-stayed bridge in North America and the 10th longest in the world. Its main span extends 853 meters across the Detroit River. The cables alone, hundreds of them, spreading from the towers like the strings of an enormous instrument, contain enough steel wire to circle the earth. The foundations were driven into bedrock, 50 man-hours below the riverbed. The construction logistics required coordinating across 2 countries, 2 legal jurisdictions, 2 regulatory frameworks, and 2 sets of labor laws simultaneously for over 6 years. The bridge is 98% complete. Commissioning is underway. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security published its final rule establishing the bridge as an official American port of entry, effective March 2nd. It was built over more than 2,000 days by union workers from both nations using American and Canadian steel, American and Canadian labor, and American and Canadian engineering. It will replace the functional monopoly of the Ambassador Bridge, a 97-year-old four-lane privately owned structure that has been the sole truck crossing between Detroit and Windsor for nearly a century, and that has become a single point of failure for the most important trade corridor in North America. The Gordie Howe will transform that corridor, a corridor that handles 25 to 30% of all U.S.-Canada truck traffic, routing over $300 billion in annual commerce through a single choke point that was built when Calvin Coolidge was president. And it cost 6.4 billion Canadian dollars, every single dollar of which was paid by Canada. That fact, 100% Canadian funded, is the foundation of everything that follows because it raises the question that the entire story hangs on. Why did Canada pay for a bridge between two countries? The answer is the 2012 crossing agreement signed by the Government of Canada and the state of Michigan under Republican Governor Rick Snyder. The deal was straightforward. A new crossing was desperately needed. The Ambassador Bridge was aging, congested, and privately controlled, creating a single point of failure for the most important trade corridor in North America. Michigan was still reeling from the aftermath of Detroit's bankruptcy and couldn't fund its share of construction. Canada needed the crossing urgently. 75% of Canadian exports to the United States transit through this corridor. So Canada offered to pay the entire cost, all of it, in exchange, joint 50-50 ownership between the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority on the Canadian side and the state of Michigan. Canada would recoup its investment through toll revenues. After repayment, Michigan would receive 50% of net toll revenues in perpetuity. Michigan contributed its land, its regulatory cooperation, and its share of the port of entry infrastructure. The deal was negotiated by a Republican governor permitted by the Obama administration in 2013 through a standard presidential permit required for all cross-spur infrastructure and endorsed by Donald Trump in 2017 in a joint statement with then Prime Minister Trudeau, in which the President of the United States called the Gordie Howe International Bridge a vital economic link between our two countries. Trump called himself the builder president. He praised cross-spur infrastructure. He endorsed this bridge, this project, this agreement by name. In 2017, Donald Trump called this bridge a vital economic link. In 2026, he is demanding compensation for an asset he didn't pay for. The bridge didn't change. The agreement didn't change. The materials didn't change. The ownership structure didn't change. The engineering didn't change. The workers who built it didn't change. The steel in it didn't change. The only thing that changed was Trump's relationship with Canada. And now, a $6.4 billion bridge that he praised as a symbol of cooperation, a bridge he stood next to figuratively and endorsed by name, has become the object of demands that reveal he has never read the contract that governs it. That's not a policy evolution. That's a man who praised a house at the open house and then showed up after closing demanding to live in it for free. And that brings us to what happened this week. The demands that shocked diplomatic observers, baffled trade lawyers, and left the White House communications team in a silence so complete that 72 hours later, they still haven't found the words. Because what Trump demanded wasn't just wrong. It was wrong in a way that revealed he doesn't understand what he's talking about. Every single claim, ownership, compensation, materials, credit was already addressed by the existing agreement. He demanded things he already has. And when someone demands things they already have, there are only two possible explanations. They haven't read the contract, or they're counting on you not having read it either. Mark Carney had read the contract. He brought it to the press conference. Carney stood at a podium in Ottawa with the 2012 crossing agreement on the lectern, the physical document visible to every camera in the room, and proceeded to dismantle Trump's demands one by one, not with rhetoric, not with diplomatic language, with the contract itself. Demand number one. Trump stated the United States should own perhaps at least 1/2 of this asset. Carney opened the agreement, turned to the ownership section, and read it directly into the microphone. The Gordie Howe International Bridge is jointly owned 50-50 by the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority in the state of Michigan. Michigan, which is, last anyone checked, part of the United States, already co-owns exactly 50% of the bridge. The president demanded half of a bridge his country already owns half of. That's not a negotiating position. That's a man who didn't do the reading. Demand number 2, Trump stated, "I will not allow this bridge to open until the United States is fully compensated for everything we have given them." Carney looked into the camera and responded with a question that hung in the room like smoke. Compensated for what exactly? Canada paid $6.4 billion to construct this bridge. The United States paid zero. Not $1 of American federal money was spent on construction. The state of Michigan contributed land and regulatory cooperation under the 2012 agreement, and in exchange receives 50% ownership and 50% of net toll revenues after Canada's investment is recovered. The United States was not asked to pay. The United States did not pay. And now the United States is demanding compensation for costs it never incurred. He paused. Let the silence do the work. Let me say that again because it's important. Canada paid $6.4 billion. The United States paid nothing. And the president of the United States wants Canada to compensate the United States. That's not economics. That's not negotiation. That's a shakedown. And Canada does not respond to shakedowns. Think about the math for a moment because the math is the entire argument. Canada paid $6.4 billion. The U.S. paid zero for that zero investment. The United States received 50% ownership of the longest cable stayed bridge in North America, 12,000 construction and operational jobs, a world-class port of entry for the nation's busiest trade corridor, and eventually 50% of net toll revenues in perpetuity. All of it for free. Canada is giving the United States half a bridge, half the toll revenue, and all the economic benefits of a modern crossing at zero cost. And the president's response is to demand compensation on top of that. The word for this isn't negotiation. The word for this isn't even entitlement. The word for this is a man who received a gift and then sent an invoice. Demand number 3. Trump claimed Canada built it with virtually no U.S. content. Carney's response was blunt. U.S. steel was used on the Michigan side of the bridge. This has been confirmed by the Windsor mayor, by the construction consortium, and by our own records. American union workers helped build this bridge over 6 years. The 2012 agreement requires that iron and steel be produced in the United States or Canada. Both were used. This claim is not a matter of interpretation. It is factually false. Windsor's mayor, Drew Dilkins, a conservative, confirmed publicly, American steel, American labor, American jobs. The claim that there was no U.S. content is simply incorrect. Michigan's Governor Whitmer added, this bridge was built by union workers from both sides of the border. American hands built this bridge. For the president to claim otherwise is an insult to the workers who spent 6 years constructing it. Demand number 4. Trump implied that Obama granted a special waiver allowing Canada to circumvent by American provisions. Carney responded with the patience of a man explaining arithmetic to someone who refuses to count. The 2012 crossing agreement signed under Republican Governor Rick Snyder specifies that iron and steel must be produced in the United States or Canada. This provision was negotiated by a Republican governor, agreed to by Canada, and reflects the binational nature of the project. The presidential permit issued by the Obama administration in 2013 is a standard regulatory action required for every cross-border infrastructure project. There was no waiver. There was no circumvention. There was a standard process followed properly, documented completely. The deeper absurdity. Trump is blaming a Democratic president for an agreement that a Republican governor signed. That's not a policy disagreement. That's factual illiteracy. And then Carney closed the folder, looked directly into the camera, and delivered the summation that would be quoted on every front page in the Western world within the hour. The President of the United States is demanding ownership of an asset his country already co-owns. He is demanding compensation for costs his country never paid. He is demanding credit for materials his country already supplied. And he is blaming a Democratic president for an agreement that a Republican governor signed. Every demand he has made is already satisfied by the existing agreement. He is demanding things he already has. The only explanation is that he hasn't read the contract. He let that land. The room was silent. Every reporter in it understood they had just witnessed something they would be writing about for years. A prime minister calmly, factually, without raising his voice or changing his expression, proving that the president of the world's most powerful nation was making demands about a document he had never opened. And I would respectfully suggest, Carney continued, his tone unchanged, that before the president makes further demands about a $6.4 billion infrastructure project, he read the contract. It's 14 pages. The relevant sections are on pages 4 through 7. I'm happy to send him a copy. The room exhaled. The offer to mail the president a copy of a contract his own country signed was the kind of line that only a former central banker, someone trained to deliver devastating information in the flattest possible tone, could pull off. It wasn't sarcasm, it was service, and the politeness made it lethal. Then the final line, cold, precise, final. Canada built this bridge. Canada paid for this bridge, and Canada will open this bridge on schedule as agreed. The question is not whether it opens. The question is whether the President of the United States will be standing on his side when it does, or whether he'll be the only person on the continent who tried to stop it. A pause, one beat. We have no further demands to reject. The press conference ended. 0 questions taken. The contract was left on the podium. Visible to every camera, a physical prop that said more than any speech could. The document is public, the numbers are real, and the argument is over. And then came the silence. 72 hours after Carney's press conference, the White House had not issued a single substantive response to any specific factual claim Carney made. Not one. No rebuttal to the ownership point because Michigan does co-own 50%. No rebuttal to the cost point because the United States did pay 0. No rebuttal to the materials point because American steel is in the bridge. No rebuttal to the Obama waiver claim because a Republican governor signed the agreement. Trump's social media shifted to other topics entirely. No further mention of the bridge, no doubling down, no escalation, no late-night posts, no nicknames, just silence. The loudest man in American politics found a topic he couldn't talk about because talking about it meant either admitting the demands were wrong or repeating claims that a contract on live television had already disproven. White House communications staff reportedly drafted 3 separate response documents and abandoned all 3. According to sources inside the communications office, the problem was structural. None of the drafts could address Carney's factual claims without confirming them. Every attempted rebuttal circled back to the same wall. The contract exists. The numbers are in the contract, and the numbers say what Carney said they say. You can't argue with a receipt. You can't dispute a contract that's sitting on a podium in front of 14 cameras with the relevant pages bookmarked. You can only sign it or pretend it doesn't exist. And then the detail that turned institutional silence into institutional humiliation. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, when asked directly about the bridge agreement by a reporter, responded with 5 words that will live in diplomatic infamy. I did not know the details. The chief trade negotiator of the United States of America, the person whose job is to know the details of every major trade arrangement on every border America shares, admitted on the record that he did not know the details of the agreement governing the largest infrastructure project on the U.S.-Canada border. The border that handles $2 trillion in annual bilateral trade, the border he is paid to manage. Carney's press conference wasn't sophisticated strategy. It was reading comprehension. And the fact that reading comprehension was sufficient to demolish the president's position tells you everything about the quality of the position. And that is when Warren Buffett weighed in. And what he said translated the entire confrontation into the language he has spoken for 70 years. The language of ownership, equity, and the difference between investing and demanding. Buffett was asked about the bridge at a Berkshire Hathaway investors briefing. He leaned forward, removed his glasses, and spoke with the directness that has made him the most trusted voice in American finance for 7 decades. I've been buying companies for 70 years, Buffett said. And in 70 years, I have never once, not once, walked into a closing table and demanded ownership of an asset I didn't pay for. Because that's not how ownership works. You invest capital, you take risk, you build equity over time, you sign the check. That's how you own things. If you paid nothing, you own nothing. That's not a political opinion. And that's the first rule of capitalism. The Gordie Howe Bridge cost $6.4 billion. Canada paid $6.4 billion. The United States paid zero. And now the president is demanding ownership and compensation. In my world, the world of actual capital allocation, the equity distribution reflects the investment. The fact that Michigan already co-owns 50% is an extraordinary gift of Canadian generosity. To demand more than what you receive for free isn't negotiation. It's something else entirely. Then Buffett delivered the line that cut to the bone of the confrontation. The most expensive mistake in business is confusing demands with leverage. Demands work when you have something the other side needs, when you control something they can't get elsewhere. When walking away costs them more than giving in, that's leverage. What leverage does the United States have on this bridge? It didn't pay for it. It didn't build it. The agreement is signed. The DHS Port of Entry ruling is published. Construction is 98% complete. The cement is poured, the steel is up, the cables are strung. There is nothing the United States can threaten that changes the fact that this bridge exists. This contract is valid, and Canada holds the receipt. When you make demands without leverage, you're not negotiating, you're performing. And the problem with performing is that eventually someone holds up the receipt. He paused. That's what Carney did. He held up the receipt, and receipts don't negotiate. When asked about Berkshire's broader positioning, Buffett connected it to his acquisition philosophy. When I acquire a company, the first thing I do is understand the existing agreements, the contracts, the obligations, the ownership structures. Before I demand anything, I know what's already been agreed, because nothing makes you look more foolish in a negotiation than demanding something that's already in the contract. He let that settle. From what I can see, every demand the president made was already satisfied by the existing agreement, which means either the president didn't read the contract or his advisors didn't brief him. Either way, the result is the same. You walk into a negotiation demanding things you already have, and the other side reads the contract into a microphone, and you have no response because there is no response. In my business, we call that due diligence failure. In diplomacy, I believe they call it embarrassment. Buffett closed with the arithmetic that will echo through this story long after the politics fade. I'll say this as simply as I can. You don't get equity for showing up. You get equity for investing. Canada invested $6.4 billion. The United States invested zero. The equity distribution reflects the investment, and no amount of demanding, no amount of threatening, no amount of performing for cameras changes the arithmetic. Arithmetic doesn't negotiate. Arithmetic doesn't care about your poll numbers or your rally speeches or your Truth Social posts. Arithmetic is the same in Ottawa as it is in Omaha, as it is in the Oval Office. 6.4 billion minus zero is 6.4 billion, and that number belongs to Canada. He removed his glasses one final time. I've seen a lot of negotiation failures in my career. Bad deals, blown acquisitions, partnerships that fell apart. But I've never seen anything quite like this. A president making demands about a contract he hasn't read, being corrected by a prime minister who brought the contract to the press conference, and then sitting in silence for 3 days because nobody on his staff can figure out how to rebut a document they all signed. That's not a negotiation failure. That's a reading failure. And it's a reading failure that cost the most powerful man in the world 3 days of credibility and gave his counterpart the easiest victory in diplomatic history. All Carney had to do was turn to page 4. Now zoom out, because the bridge is a receipt, but it's also a mirror. And what it reflects about the broader U.S.-Canada dynamic and about this administration's approach to international negotiations is more revealing than any single infrastructure dispute. The bridge demands are a microcosm of Trump's entire approach to the Canada relationship. Make demands that sound aggressive but have no factual basis. Assume the other side won't push back with documentation. Rely on volume over substance, and perform for cameras without doing the homework. It has worked with some countries, nations that lack the institutional capacity to respond with contracts and receipts, or that fear American economic retaliation enough to absorb unfounded claims rather than contest them. It does not work when the other side has a $6.4 billion receipt and a former central banker who spent his career reading financial documents. Volume loses to documentation every single time, and Carney brought the documentation. The bridge is the clearest example because the facts are so simple, the numbers so unambiguous, and the contract so public that there is nowhere to hide. Ownership already in the contract, cost allocation already in the contract, material sourcing already in the contract, labor provisions already in the contract. Everything Trump demanded is already settled in a document signed by a Republican governor 14 years ago.